Now it's time for our meeting. And normally I talk about upcoming meetings after the presentation. So I'm going to go a bit out of order because, as I mentioned, we have a special guest who's going to give us a brief overview about next month's presentation and next year's change out of the exhibit at the Missouri Historical Society. So I want to introduce Adam Kloppe, who's a historian at the Missouri History Museum. Adam, over to you.
All right, well, thanks so much, Mike. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation tonight. But yeah, my name's Adam Kloppe. I'm a public historian with the Missouri Historical Society. And I just wanted to come in real quick tonight and give you guys a tease of what I'll be here talking about next month. For the last few years, the Missouri Historical Society has been hard at work at a brand new 1904 World's Fair exhibit. The plan is for that exhibit to open in 2024. And so the old exhibit, the one, Nicole, that you said, sort of brought you to the society, that exhibit's going to be coming down in 2023 so we can get ready for this new opening in 2024. And so I just want to come back next month and sort of walk you guys through our new plans for this new exhibit. And I think they're really exciting. Just because we're taking down the old exhibit, that doesn't mean all those artifacts are going away. Some of your old favorites will still be there in that new exhibit. But we're also going to be getting out new artifacts, stuff that probably none of you have seen before, in order to show that off to people. And we're going to be, telling stories through those objects. We're going to have images. We're going to have a full-scale model of the entire world's fairgrounds that show every building and every pathway and allow people to sort of take walking tours through the fair through little iPad screens and things like that. We're going to have a rotating exhibit space that's going to change out every 2 years so we can keep that exhibit fresh and exciting and keep those interpretations as current as they can be. They're all really, really exciting plans. I can't wait to dive in more with you guys, but I want to leave you with this. Our tagline for this exhibit, and I think it's great, it's relive the wonder and re-examine the complexity. And we want every aspect of this new exhibit to do both of those things, to draw people in with the awe and the wonder that the World's Fair inspired. It inspired 19 million people, right, to come in through the gates and brought them to parts of the world they had never seen before. But it's also this really complex, knotty space, right, where ideas about race and empire and modernity and gender are all being teased out and meaning is being made around those things. And we want to tease out that complexity too. And each part of the exhibit's going to do both of those things. And like I said, I just can't wait to come back in next month and share our plans with all of you. So I look forward to it and I hope to see a lot of you there.
Neat.
Adam, thank you so much. That was, really neat and enthusiastic. And I'm looking forward to seeing that new one too. And maybe helping you out with parts of it. And like you said, some of the things that are there now will be there in the future also. For example, our masterworks for the floral clock is going to remain at the History Museum, but it's going to go on a short hiatus to be deep cleaned and maybe get that front glass repaired. We'll see about that. But now I'd like to set the stage for the presentation tonight, describing what took place at the World's Fair 118 years ago. On February 15th, 1904, it was a Monday. The worst of winter was showing and slowing the construction progress, and the construction staff of the exposition company was now over 10,000 people. They were braving the weather, as were all these people working on the state, foreign, and concession buildings. Construction on the Pike in particular was really accelerating because they had just gotten started a couple months ago with the acquisition of the land for that. And the palaces were largely being finished off with architectural details, often designed by sculptors that you'll hear about tonight. The Russian government announced that it was withdrawing from the fair. They canceled their plans for the Russian Imperial Guard Band to attend and perform. Even though the foundation for their building had been started, they said, sorry, do what you want with it. Japan's director assured President Francis that the Russo-Japanese War would not change his nation's plans to exhibit at the fair, declaring there was strong interest in the fair among Japanese merchants. In fact, the exhibit space that was allocated to Russia was quickly gobbled up by many of the other countries and a few commercial exhibitors. A representative of the Boer War exhibit said that recreations of two major battles of the Boer War, which was the British Empire's last great colonial conflict, ended in 1902, would include over 500 people, 250 Boers, 150 British troops, 30 Swazis, and 30 Kafirs. The whole company would soon set sail from Cape Town for America aboard the steamer Duane Castle. And finally, the exposition company received another application for an exhibit. This one was from Walter Hammond of Palmer, Massachusetts. He said that recreations of he wrote to fair officials that he had solved the transportation problem. He said he had perfected the individual airship. Of course, he asked the exposition company to finance his scheme. I'm guessing that his proposal was either rejected outright or maybe just ignored. And so now it's time for our presentation. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself because I don't have an opportunity to do that very often. I spent 23 years in the Air Force as a pilot and program manager for computer acquisitions. That career brought me to Scott Air Force Base in 1989, where I served 7 years in the Air Force. Leaving the Air Force in 96, I continued to work for civilian companies working at and for Scott Air Force Base for the next 22 years before retiring a few years ago. I discovered the St. Louis World's Fair in 1997 as a fair souvenir from my great-grandmother who had visited St. Louis from southern Nebraska, a small ruby flash toothpick holder. And it had her name on it, Philippi, and that was my hook for getting into learning all I could about the 1904 World's Fair. And I'm still learning new things about it. As I mentioned, I'm going to have to get with Adam and make sure that that scale model incorporates the discoveries we found out about the map. And now it's time for my presentation. I've got PowerPoint up and I'm going to share my screen and go into PowerPoint. And hopefully everybody can see my little PowerPoint screen here. And I need to move it upwards a little bit so I can hit the little button at the bottom to go full screen. Okay, so you ought to see a kind of a shadowy image there of sculpture at the 1904 World's Fair. If anybody doesn't see that, please unmute yourself and start yelling and screaming at me. Back in 1904, there was a lot of entertainment in America, in the big cities in particular, like movies and museums and Coney Island. But out west and in the Midwest here, circuses and Wild West shows were the traveling shows that came to visit cities for anywhere from a couple days to a week or so that people could have that kind of entertainment. But another type of entertainment kind of started up in the 1893, 1900 era, and that was World's Fairs. This is a cover of a dedication day program that shows where some of the palaces were planned to be, and you can kind of see Festival Hall and Art Hill out there. World's Fairs were not a new thing. They had started in Europe in the 1850s and 1870 with our centennial. Paris had a couple more, Chicago had one, Buffalo, and then we had ours that had more acreage and larger palaces than any of the previous ones. And that started a run of a lot of World's Fairs in the West, generally, of the United States. And we all know David Rowland Francis was a young St. Louis mayor who became Missouri governor for 4 years. He served as Secretary of the Interior, and he spent probably about 10, 11 years as president of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition that ended up probably being an 18-hour-a-day job. Finally, after recovering from that, he became ambassador to Russia for a couple of years and saw the fall of the czars. But as we get into sculpture, I want to tell you about Karl Bitter. Karl Bitter was born in Austria in 1867, so he was in his late 30s, 40 years old, just at the right time for the St. Louis Fair. He had worked at a couple of World's Fairs before, including being director at the 1901 Buffalo World's Fair. And he was known by many of the people that he worked with, including Carl Bitter, for his extraordinary organizational skills. And he was appointed head of the LPE, Director of Sculpture. And he did a whole lot of work on his own besides managing this effort, which probably took all of his time for about 2 years. Portrait and architectural sculptural work. And he was killed at 1915 at the age of 47, probably in the middle of his career. Well, when he became the director of sculpture, he asked for Andrew C. a $500,000 appropriation. He used his contacts in various schools to recruit dozens of the best sculptors in the world from America and Europe. A lot of these sculptors had worked on both the 1893 and 1901 fairs where he had worked. And he was in charge of assigning the work, the sculptures that they would do, and oversaw their work. And he established standards for what he wanted done. For example, I think most of us are familiar with the Colonnade of States that had 14 seated female figures with items in their hands to reflect each state. And we'll see those. But they're remarkably similar, but they're all different too. And they were done by 14 different sculptors. All in all, there were over 100 sculptors that produced over 1,200 works. Doug, there's someone in the waiting room. Most of the sculptors did many kinds of work, from portraits and statues and busts and fountains or architectural building pieces. And of that $500,000, about half of the budget went to enlarging. The sculptors did not make the big 10, 12-foot statues made out of staff. They made maquettes, models that were roughly around 2 feet. Some of them were bigger, some of them were maybe a little smaller, but 2.5 feet was the size, I think, of most of them. We'll see some of them. And then staff workers had a shop, and he established a large studio in Hoboken, New Jersey, where he could use people that he had used previously and then ship the completed statues to St. Louis on a train. He also established a working shop on the fairgrounds, and those staff workers were very well paid. They had a device called a pointer, and we might see one, I'm not sure if what I'm looking at in some of these scenes, but basically a pointer was used to guide the creation of a wooden framework of a statue, like a horse with his legs and the cowboy with his arms, and then they would put the staff on the outside of all that wood. So here's a picture of Carl Bitter inspecting a sculpture of Atlas, and you can see in the circle his maquette of Atlas. And this sculpture of Atlas, they made at least 6 of these, and they were all put on the Palace of Liberal Arts, and that big one is about 5 times bigger. And I'm not sure if that framework contained this little pointer device somehow in it, or whether it just helped to support it or not. But where did it go in the Palace of Liberal Arts? Well, looking down Government Hill, there's the Palace of Liberal Arts, and you may or may not be able to figure out that these statues of Atlas are tucked in the corners of the largest of the triumphal arches on the Palace of Liberal Arts, and there were 6 of them on this main archway. And couldn't leave out the Apotheosis. There was also a maquette for that was made by Charles Niehaus for them to make the larger staff version, which was placed on the ground. And there's old Meriwether Lewis in the background there. These are some of the staff workers that worked for a company, Barth and Stack, that made everything. And they were some of the better paid manual laborers, and we'll see some of them again a little bit later. But they would take a small sculpture and make it large, and making it out of staff, it almost looked like maybe Italian marble, and get real smooth, and just look at the detail in that cherub. They also made multiple pieces of a lot of the architectural work of staff, and the palaces as they got completed. And they just let these things sit around on the ground for months until it was time to lift them up onto the buildings. And just think how many hundreds and thousands of times they had to lift things like that up to get the staff on all of the elements of the large palaces. So let's take a look at some maps and see where the fairgrounds were. This is looking southwest over Forest Park. The History Museum is down here in the lower center. The zoo is down here in the far left. Lindell is along the bottom, and Skinker is at the boundary of Forest Park. And this is overlaying where the palaces were around the Grand Basin, and where the main areas we're going to look at and concentrate on for where all these statues were. And all the members of the society received a copy of this Norbury-Wayman map before. And if you take a good look at that, it's very easy to see, but this has all of those same places of the different plazas and Palace of Art, Festival Hall, and the approaches to Festival Hall labeled. So we'll be visiting all those different spots. And to guide us, we're going to start off with the Plaza of St. Louis, right at the main entrance where you would come in. The main entrance was kind of off in the distance here. This is looking down from the top of Festival Hall. This is the Plaza of St. Louis here. This is a diagonal view of the same thing with the 100-foot tall Louisiana Purchase Monument. And it looked a lot taller than it really was because it was out in the middle of that plaza. These towers on Varied Industries were actually about 40 feet taller. And the first big statue that you'd come to would be the Apotheosis of St. Louis, with the guiding spirits in front of it, nothing impossible. And the little statue in the front of that was called the Guiding Spirits, and there were two little angels whispering in the ears of the Lady of St. Louis. One was Genius Pointing, and the other one was Inspiration Whispers. And the motto was Nothing Impossible. So the Apotheosis was originally done in staff, and here's a picture of the Guiding Spirits and stuff by Charles Niehaus. As we go through this presentation, you will see a blue ribbon on the bottom with the name of the sculptor and some of his various works, whether they're on the fairgrounds or at other places. For example, Charles Niehaus also did a famous sculpture of John Paul Jones that's on exhibit at West Potomac Park in Washington, D.C. And I will cover some of that, but there's the statue of John Paul Jones, and the other works that are not this World's Fair, or generally not these World's Fair, are outlined in that white glow. So it was originally staff. It was cast in bronze in 1906 by Hodges because Niehaus wanted way too much money, and Hodges did it for a lot less. And then it was dedicated and presented to the city of St. Louis in 1906 when it was placed in front of the Art Museum. Oh, look at that. There it is today in front of the Art Museum. Did everybody catch that? Without the guiding spirits, unfortunately. There was another very large equestrian statue of Fernando de Soto up on about a 8 or 9 foot base, and he was about 10 or 12 feet by Edward Potter. This picture in the lower right of the Republic statue and the quadriga up on this triumphal archway, and on the other side of this colonnade there is Lake Michigan, was at the 1893 fair where Potter worked with Daniel French, who we'll come across here pretty soon. And of course, Lois Joliet, the explorer of the Mississippi, was the other famous one. There's the Palace of Manufactures behind him. And one thing he's noted for is that he designed the griffins that are up today on the roof of the Art Museum. Okay, there's the Louisiana Purchase statue, and it was kind of a collaboration. Emmanuel Masqueray was the chief of design And he designed the monument, but then Carl Bitter, our director of sculpture, did all of the statues. And Carl Bitter, several years later, also did the statue of Thomas Jefferson that is presently in the middle of the History Museum, whereas Masquerade went on and did the St. Paul Cathedral in Minnesota. And on top of it was Carl Bitter's statue of Peace. Now, if you look at this statue, it's interesting to look at the scale of the monument itself. That 100 feet didn't look awful big in that other view, but it sure looks tall in this one, with all the people sitting down taking a little breather below it. And if you look real close up at the top, you can kind of see that there's a little bit of shininess on the elements of the globe, and the statue is gilded on top also. The most famous sculpture at the bottom is the signing of the treaty by Carl Bitter. And that has Monroe and Livingston on it as they're signing the Louisiana Purchase land over to the United States. This was later cast in bronze and is out at Jefferson City, right near the state capitol. There were a couple of side sculptures, the Spirit of the Mississippi and, of course, the Spirit of Missouri. For some reason on this postcard, this one is called the Sea Rover, and I've never been able to find a reference as to why it's called the Sea Rover. And on the other side was the rostrum, which faced the large plaza, and it was used for formal occasions like opening day, closing day, famous people coming, or even when the Liberty Bell arrived. And there's David R. Francis having given a speech about welcoming the Liberty Bell to St. Louis. Now, around the foot of the Grand Basin was 4 sculptures by Solon Borglum, who sculpted these 4 statues. His brother sculpted Mount Rushmore. I lost my R there on Rushmore. Bad editing, Mike. One of the most famous is the Buffalo Dance with electricity behind it. He also sculpted the Rough Rider Monument in Phoenix, Arizona, commemorating Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Now, this one has been cast in bronze in different sizes, and these casts that date back to the early 1900s are quite valuable. Another one that's quite noted is the Blizzard, where a hardy frontiers settler is taking shelter along with his horse, who's bending down with his facing away from the wind, probably with you know, a snowstorm or a windstorm or blizzard, hoping to survive. This one struck the fancy of an awful lot of people. The Cowboy at Rest, in that it just looked like a nice Western scene that you would envision a cowboy taking a little rest and letting his horse take a rest also. And then one of the least photographed ones was a step to civilization. The Indian sage is advising the youth to embrace the white man's civilization. He's in buffalo skins and he's holding a large stick representing a connection to the unimproved land and pre-reservation lifestyles. On the other side, an Indian carries a book and is draped in fabric manufactured by the whites. He points towards civilization and therefore renewed life and progress. The young boy who crouches next to him is ready to spring in the direction of assimilation. The message is clear. To survive, Indians must throw off the chains of traditional life or perish in a misery of their own making. This was written in 1904 as kind of the story behind us. And that was just part of the culture, was to assimilate the Indians into the white man's civilization. So having finished up with the Plaza of St. Louis, we'll move on to Festival Hall, the Cascades, and the Colonnade. And obviously, they're at the top of this map, on the top of Art Hill. Here's a neat picture of Festival Hall, which was designed by Cass Gilbert, who also did the St. Louis Public Library and had a large part in designing the U.S. Supreme Court. And we're going to take a look at the three largest statues, Victory, the Triumph of Apollo, and the Cascades. We'll also look at the colonnades. But right around here where my mouse is going, there's a couple of statues that we'll see that are hardly ever noticed, because partly they're behind the Cascades. There's the Statue of Victory that was designed and sculpted by Elizabeth Longman. She also designed the Genius of Electricity for the AT&T building in New York, and it's been moved to about 3 or 4 different buildings over the last 20 years, but it's been gilded and is still in existence today. It's been called the Genius of Electricity or the Spirit of Electricity. Take your pick, as it's been moved here and there. Next down is the Triumph of Apollo. Apollo and the 9 Muses on the northern doorway to Festival Hall. Apollo is the god of poetry and song. As a youth, he's holding a lyre and a palm branch, the emblem of victory, on a chariot drawn by 2 lionesses. And I don't think you want to hear who all the 9 Muses are, but if you're into mythology, you can look them up. But they represent a lot of the sciences as of the early classical age. And of course, the Cascades came out of a substantial sculpture called the Triumph of Liberty. And it was designed also by Herman Mcneill, who did all the statues and sculptures in this view right here from top to bottom. And we're going to take a look at a few of them. You can see where the waterfall is coming out of the Cascades. And here's a close-up of the Cascades, and you can see essentially the giant bathtub where the water was pumped into to overflow this. And you can see the horses and the various figures that are there. Just a very impressive sculpture. And it shows real good and must have looked like stone. So last month we heard from Carol Diaz-Granados, who is watching us, and she showed us these 2 pictures of a lion's head that she had the honor to discover and find buried in Forest Park with her students. And she came across this photo eventually, that it was the consensus that this is where the Cascades are in the background, and this lion's head, and there's another one on the other side with the tulips hanging down from it. This is probably the lion's head because it's about 15 inches across. There were other lions at the entrances to some of the palaces, but they were much larger. And this one is, just about the right size and shape and details match up. And Carol, just for you, I came across another picture in an album that I just got showing almost exactly the same view. And with a little bit of enhancing, I was able to make it a little bit bigger and sharper, and sure looks like the same lion to me. I'll get you a copy of that, Carol. I mentioned the entrance statues. The one on the left, Music, is still in the shop being finished up. The one on the right, Dance by Tonetti, who also sculpted a large statue of Christopher Columbus for the 1893 World's Fair. Just amazing detail that they put into these. And if you catch the light right, you can see a lot of the details of what they're holding in the instruments, etc. Henry Lukman, that did Music, had a large part of sculpting Stone Mountain in Georgia, which I think is one of the world's largest sculptures in a stone mountain. So looking down from where we just were at the top of the Cascades, you see a lot more statues going all the way down Art Hill. And of course, you see 4 palaces with the monument in the distance. And you begin to get the idea that, boy, there were statues just about everywhere. How they kept track of who's doing what, how they stored them, and how they got them into the right place so that they could be put together and mounted in the right place probably took a pretty good staff of people. This is a picture, I believe, inside one of the palaces, and with a horse that's in parts that'll be taken apart and then reassembled in place. Just, amazes me when you see all these things. And lo and behold, there's some of those staff workers very carefully moving a statue. I think they're moving this to education and social economy. And Robert Bringhurst did a whole bunch of statues around that palace. That gives you a good scale that, if this tall guy here is about 6 feet and he were standing up there, this is probably a 12-foot statue. So up at the top of the Cascades were two large sculptures. One was called Physical Liberty by Herman Mcneill. He also did a statue called the Sun Vow. And the other one he did was a captive bull, and we'll look at that when it's completed. But this is in one of our palaces that doesn't have any exhibits in it. This is where they did it, and this is the bull without the female figure next to him. And they've got it loaded onto a cart. How they got it up on the cart, I don't know. Oh, did you see that little sign in the corner? Somebody's always asked me, so where were the toilets? Well, in this palace, which I think is Varied Industries, there were toilet buildings in the courtyard. And that little sign, I think, has a hand pointing, go out this door, women, to get to your bathroom, your facilities. So here's that same crew with the captive bull on that same cart, taking it the long way around Palace of Education and Social Economy to get it to the top of Art Hill. And I believe on this one, you can kind of tell that the road is heading up Art Hill here on the side to get this thing to the top. And finally they arrive, and somehow they manage to lift that thing that must weigh at least 1,000, maybe 2,000 pounds. Staff is lightweight, but when you got that much of it, I don't know. But they got it up onto its platform there, but it's still a little bit crooked, needs a little bit of adjusting. This picture has some flaws in it. But here it is in place and kind of all put together, the triumph of mind over brute force on the main Cascades, showing that the brain with education can control the giant beasts to help civilization do what needs to be done. And we go all the way down to the bottom and we find a statue called Fine Arts about a Pegasus that has just sprung from the earth. There's a maiden with a lyre and two symbolic sculptures, painting and sculpture clinging to the horse. And there you can almost make out the maidens on the side and the maiden on top. So we all know that on either side of Festival Hall, there were 14 statues representing the 13 states and Indian Territory that went out either way. And these were gigantic statues. As we look at these, take a look at the people next to the statues. The base that they are mounted on is probably about 12 or 13 feet. And the statue is another, I would guess, 11 or 12 feet. And then take a look at the colonnade behind it with the eagles in between each one on top of the columns there. Looking out the other way, we only get to see 5 of them looking this way. We'll take a closer look at some of them, but you can see that all of these statues are, made by other people. I don't think any person did 2 of them. But we'll take a look at one of them, Louisiana, up close. You can see some benches sitting around it for Louisiana. This guy, Rudolph Schwartz, was a friend of Carl Bitter, and in the lower right, he later designed the Indiana Soldiers and Sailors Monument, which is in the middle of Indianapolis. 2 other statues on the colonnade were done by Bruno Zim and John Conway, North Dakota and Oklahoma. And there's some examples of their other statues. We'll see Sacagawea a little bit later. And then the side cascades. All the statues on the side cascades, including the fountain, were done by Isidore Conti, who also did a statue in honor of President McKinley, who had been assassinated, at his memorial where he's buried. So here's our two, Spirit of the Atlantic and Spirit of the Pacific, in front of the two pavilions on either end of the Colonnade of States. Here's a closer up view of them, where the Spirit of Pacific has an albatross next to her, and the Spirit of Atlantic has an eagle down by his feet with his cape blowing behind him. And in fact, those were so popular, the Grand Trunk Railroad used them on the cover of their souvenir railroad schedule and tour guide as they brought people to the World's Fair. There's a lot of statues between. Here's the Spirit of the Pacific, I believe, here. And there were still some good sized statues and smaller ones as you worked your way down those Cascades. They got into very allegorical things of fisheries, with people working on fish and little cupids and things like that, riding fish for fun. And here's a really clean picture of a statue, which just kind of amazed me when you take this photo, which is in perfect focus, and you go in really close and you look at this strange little cupid creature riding a fish. So on the approaches to Art Hill, there were two of them going from the Plaza of Orleans over here, and then the Plaza of St. Anthony going up over here, is where they did some figural statues, full bodies of pioneers of the West were on the eastern approach to Art Hill. Meriwether Lewis, done by Charles Lopez, who did a sculpture called the Sprinter, which is often used on trophies. William Clark, a notable statue by him is Evensong. George Rogers Clark. And he did a statue in Denver called Boy and Frog, which for some reason was highly acclaimed. Daniel Boone and Pierre Marquette by Yandell and Charles Dalen. Charles Dalen, will see his sculpture Protest of the Sioux in a little bit. And the statue of Daniel Boone was widely copied and maybe slightly changed here and there, but there's a bronze cast of one that's in Louisville. And then Panfilo de Narvaez and Sieur de la Salle, with the Herbert Adams and Louis Gutebrand, who had their own sculptures that they did. And down at the bottom of the approaches were two large statues, Napoleon and Jefferson. Fittingly enough, one sold the Louisiana Purchase territory, the other one bought it. Daniel Chester French did the statue of, on the left, of Napoleon Bonaparte. He also did the statue of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial. James Frazier did the Cherokee Chief, which we'll see in a little bit, and the Indian and Buffalo nickel, which was minted for about 30 years. There's a fine statue of James Monroe, who was in the signing of the deed, by Julia Went. There were several women that did very notable sculptures at the St. Louis World's Fair. That Illinois Welcoming the Nations was at the 1893 Chicago Fair. Some other statesmen on the western approach was Beanville and Pierre Laclede, one of the founders of St. Louis, and some of their other statues that they made. Robert Livingston, here's two views of the same statue. They don't quite look the same because of the angle and how his robes are blowing out, but Henry Lukman worked on Stone Mountain. He also did the music statue in Festival Hall. So now let's look at some of the statues in the side plazas, machinery gardens, and sunken gardens, etc. We talked about the protest of the Sioux Chief earlier, vigorously protesting the confiscation of his lands in Buffalo by the white man. This was never cast in bronze, but there is a 1/3 scale statue in Springville, Utah, which is in very good detail, and you can tell it's you know, about as close as it could be, considering it was done at a different time. There was also the Cherokee Chief, and if you want to see how big things are, in the circle there is a couple, I think, sitting on the bench. That base of that is probably, I don't know, 13, 14 feet tall. The statue another 10 feet. And James Frazier did the Buffalo Nickel, as I mentioned earlier. There's a quotation in Bennett that compares these two statues of the Cherokee Chief and the protest of the Sioux, and it really denigrates this statue as the slovenly Indian on his deranged and starving pony, etc. And it's just kind of, I think that statue is pretty magnificent. I think, you know, personally, that it's a, you know, another proud Indian chief kind of seeing the end of his culture. We want to talk about The Destiny of the Red Man by Adolf Weinman. Now, some of Weinman's works, besides the coin, he did the Mercury dime, the Walking Liberty $50, but he's also responsible for something that I have some of, and I know Denny does too, and Jerry Miller if he's on, all of the medals, the grand prize and gold, silver, bronze, and commemorative medals that were given out. And we're talking about tens of thousands of those that are, oh, about 4 inches around, and they're fairly heavy. They're a good 1/8 of an inch thick. And he designed those, at least the middle part, and they're slightly different shapes. The Destiny of the Red Man faces the sunken garden in front of the US government building. And it was designed by Adolf Weinman, who also did the Fountain of Centaurs, which is in Jefferson City, right in front of Bitter's signing of the deed. So let's take a good look at the Destiny of the Red Man. There's your Indian chief, and it looks like a buffalo is carrying things, another Indian behind him. Indian chief in his regalia. There's someone riding up on top of him, and he's got this big cover over him, and there's a bird on top of him for some reason. A vulture or a hawk or something like that. The symbolism kind of surprises me sometimes, but take a look at the base compared to the benches, and this statue becomes even more impressive. Here's a slightly different view of it. And then here's another view of the backside with a woman and a child marching next to the buffalo, maybe being sent off to the reservation. So here's the sunken gardens, and down at the bottom of that is the Destiny of the Red Man. This was taken from the front steps of the US government building. And if you're on Government Hill and up around where that fountain is, partway up towards the World's Fair Pavilion, this is the view looking down. And this road at the bottom here is Government Drive, where a lot of people park for the zoo. And just look at all the statues that are up on top of liberal arts, and over here on the far right, the base of that statue with the people next to it. And look in the distance here, 300 or 400 feet away, how small the people get to these statues. And then way in the distance, this is 750 feet away, the size of that colonnade. These obelisks over here on Mines and Metallurgy are 140 feet tall. And look at the people in front of them. So over on the other side of the fairgrounds, between transportation and transportation and machinery, were machinery gardens, and there were some large sculptures there, along with some water fountains we'll see at the end. When you see the water fountains, we're about done. Laredo Taft did many fountains. He also trained a lot of women sculptures. He did a statue of Lincoln the lawyer that I think is up in Springfield. So now we're going to look at just some miscellaneous statues around the palaces. There's kind of the layout, and they're kind of scattered in whatever order felt like. Lee Laurie had a long career. He did a sculpture of Atlas that's at Rockefeller Center today. Strength and Energy. The one on the left is a guy on a bull, and the one on the right, there's actually two horses there in parallel, kind of like bucking broncos. Again, in the Palace of Manufactures, Isidore Conti did a statue of the progress of manufactures along with the McKinley Memorial, and Tonetti did one called Victory. There's about 4 statues of victory here and there. Philip Martini, who is very good at doing people and fountains and architecture. There's a small piece from the Library of Congress that he did fountains on the corners of the Palace of Manufactures. This is the Fountain of Venus, with horses coming out of the fountain and Venus standing astride them. He also did the Fountain of Neptune on another corner. And there's Neptune and a better view of him holding his trident with astride a couple of horses. Sure, why not? Now, the swinging colonnade was on the Palace of Varied Industries, and this large set of columns, I think there were about a dozen columns, about 50 odd feet tall, had a railing across the top. And on top of each column was a statue of a woman holding 2 torches of enlightenment out over the fairgrounds. And you can't tell very well from this one, but Bruno Zim did this, and also North Dakota and Sacagawea. This shot from a little bit higher up, probably near the lion on the opposite side, you can see the lion over here, of course, is looking downward, and there's a fairly good crowd walking around, and gives you some idea of the height. And I always am amazed when I see something like this. I go, how did they get a dozen of these statues up and get them mounted in place just right? 12 times. So around the Palace of Education, Robert Bringhurst did all the statues for education and social economy. And I'll let you read the titles and take a quick look at them. There were about 5 or 6 statues of music around the different buildings also. That was a very popular theme. At the main entrance to mines and metallurgy, there were enormous statues. 2 of the entrances had 140-foot high obelisks. Their bases and tops were ornamented. The entrance surmounted by a 30-foot globe on top. And the figures holding or around the globe were 28 feet tall. Where's the mouse? There we go. They were ornamented to symbolize the 4 main metals, which were gold, silver, iron, and copper. Here's another statue of copper over one of the side entrances of mines and metallurgy. Now, not to be left out, Bitter was responsible for decorating the palaces and the fairgrounds. The states were responsible for decorating their own building, and Missouri didn't want to be left out, so they got some statues of bears and some seated figures at the main entrance. And this one in particular, I was able to get a really good view of, is a statue of agriculture. If we take a look at the Palace of Electricity, Power by Henry Lukman did this statue. And then around the Palace of Liberal Arts, there's 2 statues that I think were done by Bissell and Harvey, ceramics and music. And around several different buildings, there was a lot of statuary, varied industries, manufacturers, and education by some of the people whose names you've heard before. And transportation couldn't be left out. There were allegorical figures of transportation by water, woman on a boat, by land and water. I'm not sure what she's sitting on, and transportation by rail. And she has, I think, some symbols of, oh, she's holding a small train engine, I think. And then on top, I mentioned that there were quadrigas, which is a chariot and 4 horses. This one in particular was on top of the education building and social economy, which for about a year was called the textile building before they swapped all the names around. Charles Lopez from Mexico did this sculpture. And they put statues on top of columns. In the middle of the Plateau of States, there was a very noted statue, and the German building had a European type sculpture in front of its main entrance. And we're getting down to Sacagawea, that for a long time I didn't know where this was located. It took me a long time to find a statue of this, but it was put in front of what one person called the Women's Building, but we know that that's actually the base for the DeForest Wireless Telegraph Tower. And look how small how large that statue is in the detail, and it's as large as probably the rest of these by Bruno Zim. But against a 300-foot tall tower, it definitely looks small. So we're going to take a quick look inside some of the palaces and the Palace of Art. The first one that comes to mind inside one of the palaces is Alabama didn't build a building, but the Alabama businessmen, to show off the Birmingham's steel and iron industry, had this 56-foot tall statue of Vulcan made. And he started with a maquette and a smaller one. This was not done in staff. This was done in steel down in Alabama, and then it was disassembled and brought up here and put on exhibit, and then disassembled afterwards and eventually put on a large tower down on top of Red Mountain outside of Birmingham. He's been redone over the last few years and repainted and refinished, and the monument has been strengthened and added to with the museum at the bottom. But here he is in 1904, and here he is today, you know, definitely painted gray. Does one look as good as the other, or the same, or kind of hard to tell? Moretti also did a famous statue called the Head of Christ down in the bottom. And one more view, and I like this view in particular because look at all that lumber and wood up there. You can also see the skylights, the windows that are vertical up in the rooftop of the Palace of Mines and Metallurgy to let the hot air out and let the light in. So all the statuary was around, and if you were well enough off, you might want to buy some. So there were at least 2 large Italian companies that sent hundreds of Italian marble over here made by their sculptors. This is the Lapiri brothers booth. And this is, I think, Lavini and Colonnade with a bunch of statues for sale. And not all of them were large, some were smaller. But if you come across someone that has an Italian marble statuary and their family says, you know, this was bought at the World's Fair in 1904, I can't imagine any place else in St. Louis where you could buy as many different statues as the World's Fair. They also took some very good shots and put them on stereo views. You can tell by the curved corners. Here's one that's titled From Lapini Brothers, Crossing the Stream. Young lady holding up her skirt. And Beatrice is the bust of the lady on the left. And then here's a statue that you might recognize. Adam, are you still here? I bet you'd recognize that one. The statue in the front left center is called Aurora, and it's on display at the Missouri History Museum as we speak by, I think, Frank Saul. And we got to take a look at the Palace of Art by Cass Gilbert. He went on to design the Central Public Library downtown and then the Minnesota State Capitol. And here's what the Palace of Art looked like in 1904 and one of its annexes over here. And let's just jump forward 100 and some odd years and take a quick look at what it looks like today. The statues in the alcoves are gone. The griffins are still there. The statue up on top here is gone. These figures across in front of the pediment are still there. I was lucky and just caught this picture that was almost the same as what it looked like back in 1904. And oh, the chimneys are gone, aren't they? Coming down the home stretch here, folks. In front of the Palace of Art were two larger than life sculptures, painting and sculpture, by Augustus Louis St. Gaudens, who did Hiawatha and also a standing Lincoln, and Daniel Chester French, who did the Lincoln Memorial and the Republic statue. There's a kind of a colorized version of the Republic that I said was gilded at the 1893 Chicago Fair. But these were very popular. They were made in staff in 1904. And that's what they look like today, done in stone. And they were done in stone a little bit later on, I think in the 1907, 1908 timeframe. They were so popular, they didn't want to get rid of them. And so the city and the art museum paid to have them resculpted. Going inside in Sculpture Hall, we get a glimpse of how the Victorians exhibited art. They tended to just squeeze things in until they got full and they ran out of wall space to put statues on display. You can see in the alcove to the left of George Washington how many pictures and paintings that they have on the wall back there. And finally, we're going to take a quick look at some of the statues on the Pike. And we're going to take one side trip and go back in time to probably about early 1903, when Remington had started with a picture of the cowboys. And he was also a famous artist who did painting and sculpture. There's another one of his famous paintings of the smoke signal. And here's where they were working on making these individual horses and cowboys together. And I'm beginning to think that a lot of this wood framework on top has to do with the pointer of how they would take a small scale model and then make it larger. Now this horse is obviously not very well done yet. The cowboy's missing an arm, very rough. It looks like maybe a, junior high kid did it. But when they were done, they produced a horse and a rider that looked something like that. And when I'll get to that in a minute. And when it was all done, there's cowboys off the trail. Although this one postcard calls it cowboys off the train. Now, if you look in between the two guns in the middle, you cannot see the guy's head there because his head is bent so far back on this postcard. And maybe it was taken from a slightly different angle. His head's pretty far back on that one. But there's a sculpture, and the sculpture got renamed because the manufacturer that bought the rights to it didn't think that they'd be able to sell very many bronzes called Cowboys Shooting Up the Town or whatever. So they called it Coming Through the Rye. The Cowboys doing the same thing. And it's, extremely well detailed, as are most of his bronze sculptures from what he made way back then. Now, there's one other last statue got to show because it's probably the biggest statue on the fairgrounds, the entrance to creation. I think this was on the order of 45 or 50 feet. It's not named or anything. It just has to do with creation. Nobody knows whether it's Eve or who knows. But every once in a while, you find a real photo of it that you can overlay and say, that's pretty good size there. That was made out of staff, just like everything else in this photograph. The whole framework of wood underneath these little decorated windows, these little archways, these sculptures here where it says creation up at the top. I can't imagine how many tons of staff went into what you're looking at right here. And afterwards, they took it away. Well, near as we can tell, when this picture surfaced several days ago in an album that I acquired, a personal album, this is the Palace of Machinery in the background and varied industries behind it. This is probably in Machinery Gardens where those two statues were. And this is where, for a penny, I guess you could fill up a cup of water. Or maybe it was city water and you could, get all you wanted. Because I've also seen water fountains that had filtered water in big, large 10-gallon tubs, particularly on the Pike. And those were imported water that might have been a bit cleaner. But of course, remember, the water being used in the Cascades and lagoons was all pretty good filtered water. The woman is either rubbing her eye or maybe she doesn't appreciate the smell that much. And the little girl is waiting her turn, I guess. The one on the left is the same fountain that someone found a picture of the same one. And the statue on the right, a little boy getting his cup of water filled up. No one, I suspect that these are iron statues that were, cast and reproduced by the people that made the water fountain. Because if they were staff, they wouldn't have lasted but a few weeks getting, wet from everything. And that pretty much ends up the tour. And take a look. I'm kind of tired and love seeing Festival Hall at night. And we'll finish up, and I'll see with Doug if there's any questions. And I'll keep this up in case, I'll keep this up in case we want to go look at any pictures. Doug, did I bore everybody to death, or everybody amazed at all the statues?
Well, there's almost as many people here now as there was when you started, so that's good. And there's been no questions.
I thought this was excellent, Mike, and I got so much out of it, and I've never come away from a study of the fair where I wanted so badly to go back there.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I goofed tuning in tonight. When Mills Fountain went up in front of Union Station, people really were upset about the nudity of the statues. Was there any problems with all of the statues in 1904?
Well,
do you know?
I've read that a couple of statues like Lewis and Clark on the approaches to Art Hill were purchased and then just transported out to Portland, where in 1905 they had the Lewis and Clark exposition. I know that one of the people standing, and the name escapes me of which one it is, but I remember Louise had two postcards of the same view looking down a hill, I think in a cemetery on the south side of the city. And the second one shows the statue without a head, because 3 or 4 years later it had deteriorated and gotten weak and fallen apart. These statues weren't made to last more than a year or two, and they sure enough didn't, even though they might paint them with some semi-waterproof paint and stuff like that.
No, I'm asking about the nudity of statues, the statuary itself.
Oh, the nudity.
Because I know when Mills Fountain went up, there was an outcry of St. Louis citizens because Mississippi and Missouri were both nude figures. And I didn't know if in 1904, when I looked at some of the statues that you had are beautiful, but maybe because they were more on the classic side, I don't know if there was any kind of problem.
Well, the Victorians kind of had double standards. With real people, you had to cover everything down to the wrist and ankle, and the lady couldn't show skin, and most men didn't show much skin either.
Yeah.
However, statues of allegorical figures, going back to the Greek or Roman gods, etc., nudity was semi-acceptable. The allegorical statues, for example, the giant ones on the Colonnade, were done either half undraped or totally undraped, and it just was a thing that they did with their statues. And I know in one diary from the fair, there's a story about a 12-year-old that went to the fair, and every once in a while his mother or his grandfather would grab his hand and they'd walk real fast going past a statue. They didn't want him looking at it too much.
Well, it was an excellent presentation. I'll catch up on the web then for the parts that I've missed.
Okay, we'll get it posted in the next few days, I hope.
Okay.
Jonathan Daner, do you have a question? I see your hand up, I think. I can't see the small view anymore.
That means I love your presentation.
Ah,
We could have signed it. We could do that.
Okay, now I'm getting to where I can see people again, instead of just the thumbnail view. Any other questions? I'll tell you, I learned a lot. I was amazed at how many different sculptors that Bidder was able to recruit. That I'd say a dozen of them did 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5 statues, and that doesn't count all the small architectural elements, like the little triangles that would go over doorways or between an archway and a square archway, those little corners that are, etc. You know, they didn't want to leave things like that blank, and sculptors would often, you know, do work to fill those up with stuff. And that's why when you look at the pictures of the palaces, the more you look at them, the more detail you'll see.
Hey, Mike,
right.
Charles Kaler has a question.
Go ahead.
Unmute yourself, Charles. All right, how about Bonnie? Go ahead, Bonnie Court.
Down in the lower left, Charles, there's a little microphone.
I was just going to say, excellent presentation, and also you might want to go full screen now that your presentation is over, so that people can see each other.
Well,
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
There, how's that?
great, great. Excellent presentation, though. Thank you, thank you.
voice now.
Bonnie, are you?
How long did I ramble on? About 45 or 50 minutes?
A little bit over that.
But it wasn't rambling. It was fascinating.
Well, I always like telling people that when I give a presentation about the fair overall, several times during the presentation, I will emphasize and show pictures of the palaces and how large they were. And, you know, yeah, they had to tear it all down because they were temporary, etc. I learned a different angle on that with all of these statues, that the statues were enormous. And there were, it seems like a zillion of them, because I didn't show probably more than 60 or 70 statues, I don't think.
And there were
Maybe 80.
1,200.
And there were 1,200, yeah. Now that 1,200 might include some of the architectural works that they did, you know, on the palaces themselves. Whenever you look at a palace, look at the roof line, look just below the roof line, look around the base of it, and you'll see, you know, so many statues that the names all get mixed up and confused. And like I said, I don't know how they kept track of them. And I always have this picture on, or in my mind of, let's say April 28th or 29th, a couple of those workers with a statue on a cart with some horses in front going, where does this go? Where does this one go? We got one statue left over.
Mike, do you know what happened to the statues that were outside of the art museum? Were they staff and that just disintegrated, or those that the before and after that you had?
Oh, and the before and after, the statues that were in the corners.
And the alcove.
Holly,
Yeah.
Holly, are you still on? Holly Childress? I believe most of the sculptures for the art museum were done in stone or bronze, and they were, you know, meant to be semi-permanent. I don't know if the Louisiana Purchase Company got to keep them or not, but I do know that those statues in those 2 niches were removed, and that now they're just windows.
They were originally supposed to make those 2 sculptures in the alcoves permanent. I'm not exactly sure why they did not become permanent. Also, that statue on top, which was called Inspiration by Andrew O'Connor, that one was supposed to be permanent as well, but I don't know what happened with that. The griffins that are on the building now are replicas. The real ones are in storage. And the painting sculpture that flanks the left side, The permanent one
Mhm.
was finished by Mrs. St. Gaudens because Louis St. Gaudens had passed away by the time that making that permanent rolled around.
That's right.
I've seen that picture of her working on the sculpture a little bit, if she's trimming it or sanding it. She doesn't have a hammer, but she's got her hand out checking something on it on the final stone statue. Are they marbled?
Yeah, they were supposed to be made in bronze, but there was an exchange between the artists and Bigsby and whatnot. So they thought that it would look better and match the building being in the Tennessee marble versus the bronze.
Yeah. Holly, do you know if the griffins were gilded in 1904?
They were I think they were gilded copper or hammered copper. Not 100% on that without my notes.
That's okay. Yeah, I know there was a dialogue on, and I went looking for it on Facebook a couple months ago about when those got converted, because I guess that they left the staff statues there for a couple of years, but then they took them away because they were probably starting to fall apart. And there's some pictures of the art museum with no statues at all, right?
Yeah, they're because the permanent ones were unveiled in October. Of 1915. So the permanent ones were in 1915, and they started discussing the permanent ones in 1913. The replica griffins that are up there now, I think those got switched out in the 90s.
Oh, so the original ones were up there for decades.
Yeah, I think there's one time I think something had to be repaired on one of them because it kind of came unlatched. I don't remember what year that was though.
Okay. Well, Holly, sorry to put you on the spot, but thanks for your information. I had the years wrong. I knew it was several years after the fair that they were resculpted in stone, and I just took a guess.
Okay.
Mike?
Yeah.
I want to use Festival Hall as an example. You showed Festival Hall, and then you showed the application of statuary in various places. To what extent did the architect dictate what the statuary was going to be? Was it in his drawings? Did he have nothing to say, or was it all one vision?
That's a real good question. And I don't know how to answer that. Let's start with Festival Hall. Obviously, as Cass Gilbert was designing Festival Hall, he wanted to have something where the water would come out. He wanted something over the main doorway, but then higher up where the dome was, he wanted another big thing up there. And then you got to have something up on top. But then they wanted a couple more on either side of the entrance. So they figured out either a base or whatever to put those on. I think if I had to guess, just looking at things like liberal arts, there were places that were planned for statues to go, like a quadriga up on top of a triumphal arch, et cetera, on the palaces. Smaller sculptures, you know, as you work your way down, and an awful lot of the statues were just on bases around the border of a statue. So they could have kind of gone anywhere. But you're entirely correct. I think there had to be some cooperation between Bitter, in charge of all the sculptures, to say, okay, this is gonna be mines and metallurgy. And what's your initial thing? Okay, we're gonna do some obelisks, and we're gonna have this big globe held up by some things, and you know, some people holding it up and stuff, kind of in between the obelisks on the rooftop. Think we can do that? And he said, okay, who do you want, who, you know, have you got anybody in mind to do those sculptures, or, you know, et cetera? And just kind of matching up a sculptor with, you know, the building designer early on, so that they would make something small, and hopefully it would all work out in the end. That's just a pure speculation on my part.
Mike, talk about the situation where on Festival Hall, some of the most beautiful sculptures were put in a location that it was impossible to see because of the angle. You have to go so far down to get to the top of Art Hill that you can no longer clearly see the piece of art. You had a slide about that, and I don't remember seeing it.
Okay, well, let me take a quick swing back, and since Festival Hall's come up a couple times.
Because I'm thinking that a lot of the artwork that was just riveting was placed in such a way, especially the ones on liberal arts and other places like that, where, how do you get a good look at it? The angle is all wrong. It's too high up.
Okay, hopefully now you can see my PowerPoint, and I'm going to go full screen.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, and as you take pictures, and I've seen some pictures taken from around the edge of the Grand Basin, you're starting to look up very steeply at Festival Hall. And as you climb up here, you probably couldn't see the ones that are on the side of the entrances because they're kind of behind the Cascades. This one you'd crane your neck up to look at. And this photograph is taken from the roof of Education, with a, I won't say a zoom lens, but a zoomed in lens to be able to look at it somewhat level. But if you take a look at some of the public libraries, close-ups of Festival Hall, and you look around the base of the dome here, there's little cherubs with trumpets and all sorts of scroll work, some of which was gilded around the skylights up here. And I think the skylights are what's in blue. You can clearly make out the windows. And this dome was an outer dome. There's also an inner dome inside where the performances were done that was probably a good, 40 feet or so below this dome. And it had skylights too to let the light in. But when you look at the detail around the upper part of Festival Hall here, you couldn't see it by walking around the edge of it because it was just too steep up there, and it was hidden by all these columns, which were a little bit bigger. It's only from a distance when you walked along the Colonnade Estates and you got the side view that you could probably see more of that detail and appreciate it, even if it's at a distance.
Yeah, and that triumph of Apollo that is up high, but right in the front of Festival Hall, you showed a picture of that by itself, and it was extremely detailed. And how would you appreciate all that detail? There you go. How would you appreciate all that detail when it's located on an angle that you can't really see it?
That's a good question, because that's on the front, and you couldn't be on the Colonnade and see that very well. This is obviously a studio shot, against a dark background or with lights shining on it to show the finished or near finished product before it was cut up into pieces to be reassembled.
Wow.
And it amazes me when you think of that one being cut up in pieces to be reassembled. And if you look here at the Triumph of Liberty, where the Cascades are, and Carol Diaz-Granados' little lions that are sitting right here on this the base of this column where I'm wiggling the mouse. We'll see that in just a second. There's the lion right there. And by the time you get up close enough to it, you know, those upper things, you're looking at, you know, almost, I won't say straight up, but at a severe angle, and you would never get to see a view like this. I'm not sure where this view was taken from. It must have been one heck of a good lens. My guess is there was a platform that was put in the middle of the big part of the Grand Basin for
Right.
quite a while, and it was used to take some photographs of the colonnade and stuff. So my guess is that might have been taken from here with a magnifying lens to get this kind of detail. And you see there they are going up and seeing the waterfall rushing down. Must have been pretty noisy that's a pretty good sized waterfall with lion, you know, coming in close there. And then without losing too much detail, I could even zoom it in a little bit more. Any more questions?
Got one.
There were a couple in the chat room.
What I wanted to ask about there is, you know, in the Victorian garden at the Shaw's Garden, you know, as you're facing this home to the left is a statue of Juno with the formal Victorian gardens. On the opposite side of Shaw's home, the Tower Grove house, is the fountain that has the two arms. She has, it's bronze, and it says it's from the World's Fair on the plaque. And I'm wondering, is that the same one where the boy was, that picture of the boy? With the fountain, with the woman.
Oh, with the fountain, That's very possible.
Well-
I don't know. I can't say one way or another.
Okay.
Well, Karen, what I found in my research, it said that statue that's in the fountain next to Shaw's house with I don't know, it's a Greek goddess or a Roman goddess with two little urns that are spilling out water, that was at the Lindell entrance to the fair. Now, I've never seen a picture of the Lindell entrance, but that's what I've read.
Okay.
Mike, this has been the best show you put on. Because you just couldn't see all of that. Even if you went to the fair, you couldn't see all of this that we've seen tonight.
That is right. That is right.
Mhm.
Now, just to see these statues would probably take 3 whole days at the fair, and you know, going off a checklist. I've gotten a copy of the list of exhibits in the Palace of Art, listing most of the paintings. And you know, if you go into an alcove and you see 30 paintings, how many are you going to be able to look at or really appreciate? But one of those catalogs I have, which is probably 100 pages, and there's probably about 25 or 30 lists of paintings on each page, has little check marks of what this guy saw.
That's wow.
Now, there's a question in the chat room from RA. Were there any statues taken down to Cape Girardeau and placed at Southeast Missouri State University Memorial Hall? In May, I hope to have a presentation from Frank Nickel, and I ought to get to that before I forget and kind of wrap the official part of this meeting up. Frank Nickel works for one of the foundations down there, and he taught at Southeast Missouri State for over 40 years. And he knows the story of the Gerber Houck statues. And just briefly, this man Gerber figured out a way to make a certain alabaster mix and to take casts without harming some of the classical statues in Germany. And they made casts of about 30 or 40 odd statues, brought them to the World's Fair, and put them on display in the various German exhibits in the different buildings. I was thinking of putting one picture of that as kind of a tease into this program. And I kind of ran out of time to find the right picture and put it in the right place. But in May, we're going to get a presentation all about that.
Okay.
So the answer is the staff statues were not taken down there, but the ones that this German Gerber, and I forgot his name. Do I have it with me? Oh, I do. Augustus Gerber made these statues, and this benefactor for Southeast Missouri State liked them so much, he spent a bunch of money and bought about half of them and took them down there. And they've been on exhibit in different places through the decades since then. Let's see, anything else here? Washington University Art School had some statues that they used for models. Also, there was a building in Forest Park, according to James Hauser, that housed some of the staff sculptures until sometimes in the 50s or 60s when the building was torn down. I've not heard that. Diane, if you're still listening, I do know that there, what was the WashU building that was up until the 30s? The Orangery, the British building?
Oh, yeah, I think until the 20s, the Orangery building, right?
Yeah.
That was
But
the
were there
art
any
school.
statues in there that might have been staff statues from the fair that were housed until that building was taken down?
Oh,
I've never heard that.
I haven't either.
That was from somebody with the initials CD, apparently. Oh, Carol Diaz Granados. Carol, are you still on?
I saw her a second ago. Carol.
Yes, I'm here.
The statues that were supposedly in a building from the, statues from the fair that were in a building that were still the original staff statues until the 50s. Neither Diane Rodemaker or myself have ever heard that.
Yeah, well, I'm a lot older than you guys. Jim Hauser, who was the director of the St. Louis Science Center for many years, some of you probably remember him. He told me about that building in Forest Park, and one day he took me over to where it was supposed to be, and he said, oh my gosh, they tore it down. So whatever was in there disappeared along with the building.
Oh, that's a shame.
And some of our models, when I was in art school at Washington University, we had white staff statues that they would use sometimes for models. I'm sure those were from the fair too. And
what a disappointment. You didn't get to see actual naked people?
Oh, we did. Too many.
Oh, okay,
good. But Diane should know about, there was a Indian on a horse that was moved to one of the parks, I believe in North St. Louis. Do you know that, Perrin?
Yes, I had that picture, of my grandpa holding my aunt from 1908, I think it was, and it was in O'Fallon Park.
Okay, good. Mm-hmm. And it was there for several years, and it little by little melted. They say it had to be taken down.
Yeah, I think Louise had a postcard of that too. But yeah, it's long gone.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that was a park. It might have been a O'Fallon Park in the north or a park in the south, but she had two postcards, and one showed, the statue with the head, and the other one, the head's totally gone.
Yeah, and the statue of James Monroe, I had heard that it was moved to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and I got to go there one time, and the story was that every year, I guess it was, a fraternity would steal the statue, but then they would bring it back. And one year they stole the statue and it never returned. but that statue was at one point in time at the University of Virginia.
Carol Diaz Granados also made a comment earlier that Zolnay, who was one of the sculptors I listed, also did the lions at the entrance to University City.
Oh, yeah.
Now, when you're just sitting there looking at Wikipedia and a few other sources for, you got a guy's name and he did this statue at the fair, and you want to find maybe one other thing that he did, and you want to find something that people might know or remember, and you don't want something that, this young guy did at the fair, and then something that he did in the 1930s or 40s when he was an old guy. I want to try to keep it kind of Victorian period. So I was kind of looking for, examples of some of their other work, but you can pick any one of these guys. And, I've got a list of about 25 sculptors that did more than one statue or that I talked about tonight. And I don't know if it would be worthwhile to publish that list or not, but if people wanted to go looking, you can start at Wikipedia and then you can Google other places. Wikipedia, with some of the sculptors, one of them actually had the staff sculpture of one of the statesmen or frontier people on the main article for this one guy, but most of the mentions hardly mention World's Fair work at all, because 1893, 1901, 1904 was all temporary. It's all gone unless it was recast in bronze later on. And some of these pieces were, like Solon Borglum's frontier statues at the Grand Basin, or Daniel Boone, they did get recast. So some of them are around in a more permanent form now.
And Zolnay did a sculpture. I think it's made out of marble, that was sent to, and it was on exhibit at the fair. It was indoors, and it was sent to Atascadero, California, which is where, who was the founder of U City? What's his name?
E.G. Lewis.
E.G. Lewis.
E.G. Lewis. Okay. Well, he relocated to Atascadero, and somehow that statue, it's of 3 like dancing water nymphs that was sent out there. In the Still Shining book, you can read a little bit about that.
Yeah.
I was just going to say.
Well, let me, I guess, wrap this up and tell you, if there's one more question that someone wants to start speaking right now, go ahead.
I believe it was Zolnay also who did the Confederate statue that was removed from Forest Park. I don't know where it is right now. The words were interesting, and I'm sure that's part of the reason why it was removed, but it was a wonderful monument as far as art goes.
He was supposed to go to the Civil War Museum down at Jefferson Barracks.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, that's what they said they were going to do with it.
Yeah, the Missouri Civil War Museum basically, I think, has taken control of that, and they're going to put it somewhere until someone has a nice place to exhibit it without causing controversy.
Like,
who knows when that might be.
You know that Frederick Remington's 4 Horsemen coming through the Rye is in Oklahoma City, recast in Oklahoma City at the Western Heritage Museum.
What happened?
It's a cool museum.
Yeah.
One
Okay,
question, if I can. Okay.
Go.
What happened to the maquettes that were used to, from which the statues were made?
That's a good question, because they would have been made out of a something better than staff, one would assume, and they could easily be protected somewhere. I don't know. Does anybody know if sculptors usually destroy their models after they make a big one?
Oh, I guess see, we're only on for 40 minutes. Shucks.
Don't know. Good question. I thought of that a few days ago.
Boy, if they'd been
Okay.
preserved someplace, that would be wonderful.
That would be. I kind of doubt they are, though. They, I did come across a thing that said Longman's statue of Victory on top of Festival Hall. But I think about 10 or 15 years ago, somebody found maybe the maquette that was designed from, 15, 18 inches tall. It was discovered and it was put up at auction, and it went for $7,800. And the comment was made on one of these sculpture sites that seems like an incredibly small amount for something that was a breakthrough sculpture and so famous to launch a career.
Cheap, cheap, cheap. That buyer really got a deal.
They must have. Okay, so thank you all for your compliments. I scrolled up and down the staff or the chat comments a little bit. I became absorbed in this project because I was looking up more of the artists and what they did and their connections. And I was, like I said, amazed that, some of them did 4 or 5 of these major works for this one thing. But then you realize they're just doing a maquette, and then they hand it off and they can, they're done with it for the next few months while the staff people, kind of take over. At any rate, here's some news about upcoming meetings that I alluded to earlier. I'm always working on future meetings, but I still want to have things like a show and tell with all of us there sometime in the not too distant future, but I don't think that's going to happen in the next few months. So here's my plans through June. Wednesday, March 16th, Adam Kloppe will give a Zoom presentation to tell us more details about the planning for the new exhibit. He gave us a little tease tonight, but he'll have some diagrams and layouts, and he'll tell us more about the details being planned. And the clock, our floral clock masterworks, will be part of the new display. On Saturday, April 30th, I'm leaving the location blank and I'm leaving the time blank for now, probably until the end of March, hoping we can have a program get together. But in order to have a program in my hip pocket, I'm going to reprise a program from 2016 that I did with David Warner about the floral clock and the history and how it works and how we acquired it and the inside of it and stuff like that. And I hope that we can do that and celebrate our party together and appropriately. In mid-May, the exact date's not yet determined, as I mentioned, Frank Nickel is going to give us a presentation. He's the director of the Kellerman Foundation in Cape Girardeau. And he'll tell us about the cast statues from Germany that were shown at the World's Fair, won a grand prize, and many of them are now on display at Southeast Missouri State down in the Cape. And then on Sunday, June 12th, we'll have our annual picnic at our favorite picnic area in Forest Park, Picnic Area 11. And that's only 4 months away. It's February already.